He didn't die in a hail of bullets. He didn't flip. He didn't run. The most powerful mob boss in American history died in a recliner, wearing slippers, watching TV. No blood, no trial, no last words, and that terrified the men who followed him. Because if Carlo Gambino could vanish quietly, then power was never what they thought it was. It was something colder, smarter, quieter. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, please like it and subscribe to support the channel. It was the kind of death no one gets in this world. Not in his world. October 15th, 1976. The air outside was cool, crisp, almost serene. Inside the modest split-level home on Club Drive in Massapequa, Long Island, the night was still. No sirens, no headlights, no sound, but the faint hum of a television. A rerun of the Rockford Files flickered silently across the living room. A glass of water sat on the small end table beside a recliner. The slippers were velvet, the cardigan brown, buttoned halfway. Carlo Gambino didn't die in a hail of bullets. He didn't die gasping behind bars. There was no final indictment, no last betrayal, no whispered confession. He leaned back in his chair. His breathing slowed, and then it just stopped. At 74, the most powerful mob boss in American history, the boss of bosses, died watching television in his own home with no one to see it happen. No ambulance rushed in time. No last rites were read. When the family found him, it was already too late. And that, more than anything, terrified the men who followed him. Because it wasn't just that he'd lived, it was that he'd survived. And in a world ruled by bullets, betrayals, wiretaps, and cell doors, Carlo Gambino had disappeared into legend with a whisper, not a bang. But that moment, that peaceful end, is only shocking when you know what came before. Because to reach that chair, that silence, that slippered exit from the underworld, he'd played a game of ruthless precision. A 5-decade campaign of quiet maneuvering, untraceable influence, and decisions that left corpses where words once stood. His name never screamed from the headlines. His photo rarely made the papers. But the shadow he cast, it stretched across states, across decades, across lives. And it all started far from Club Drive, Long Island, thousands of miles away, across the Atlantic, on a different kind of island. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24th, 1902, in a small village called Cacamo, perched in the hills of Palermo, Sicily. If you close your eyes, you can still picture it. Dry, olive-colored earth, narrow, sun-bleached roads, stone houses clustered beneath a sky that always looked too wide for comfort. His family belonged to the old world, a world where silence was a virtue and revenge a duty. Carlo's relatives were tied to the honored society, the predecessor of the modern mafia. Honor didn't come from laws. It came from the blood. Respect was earned with silence, and betrayal wasn't forgiven. It was buried. He was a thin child, sharp-eyed, always watching, never loud. His father, a man of local standing, taught him the old codes early. Trust your blood, never speak what shouldn't be spoken, and never forget an insult. He didn't need to be told twice. By the time he was 12, the First World War was raging across Europe. But in Sicily, the rules didn't change. The land was poor, the choices fewer. You worked, you obeyed, or you found another way. Carlo found another way. By 19, he'd already been inducted into the local mafia, not with ceremony, but with silence and blood. No newspaper marked the moment. No government knew it had happened, but in the hills above Palermo, Carlo Gambino was now a man other men feared. And yet, in 1921, he left it behind. Not because he was afraid, not because he had failed, but because he saw something few others saw. The future wasn't in the hills of Sicily, it was across the water, in the chaos and promise of America. So he boarded a ship under the name Charles. He didn't speak English, he carried no wealth, but in his coat he carried something more powerful, the codes of Sicily: honor, loyalty, control. When he passed through Ellis Island, he became another immigrant with nothing to his name. But by the time he died, the streets that once judged his silence would belong to him. Brooklyn in the 1920s was a place that chewed up names and spit out legends. Streets bled with the noise of ambition, the rattle of streetcars, the cry of peddlers, the crack of baseball bats, and the whisper of backroom deals. Prohibition had turned crime into a business. Alcohol flowed in through Canada and the ports. Gangsters were no longer just bruisers in alleyways. They were entrepreneurs, kings in tailored suits. But Carlo Gambino didn't dress loud. He didn't drive fancy cars. He didn't pose for photographs. While the world looked at Capone and Luciano, Gambino slipped through the cracks, building something quieter, something stronger. He started small, working with his cousins, the Castellanos, in bootlegging operations. He ran errands, transported goods, watched, always watched, and he made allies, not the kind who liked headlines, but the kind who got things done. He found his way into the circles of Vincent Mangano, Albert Anastasia, and eventually Lucky Luciano himself. But he never made noise, no arrests, no scandals, no witnesses. He wasn't the kind of man who kicked in doors. He was the one who locked them from the inside. And over time, something remarkable happened. People began obeying him without quite knowing when they'd started. Decades later, long after he'd seized power, after the bodies had dropped and the titles shifted, men in dark suits would whisper the same thing about Carlo Gambino. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. And so now, we return to the quiet house in Massapequa. Outside, the leaves rustled. Autumn in Long Island had arrived with its soft winds and early dusk. Inside, Gambino's wife was in the kitchen. She'd cooked a simple meal: pasta, bread, black coffee. The house still smelled of garlic and soap. A grandson had stopped by earlier. He'd kissed Carlo on the cheek, not knowing it would be the last time. The television played a detective show, ironic perhaps, and the old man in the recliner, the man who had once ordered the deaths of men who didn't listen, leaned back. Not to think, not to plan, just to breathe. He hadn't run from the law. He hadn't been forced to testify. He hadn't fled to South America or begged for deals in the dark. He had played the game on his terms, and somehow, impossibly, he had won. And when the breath left his body, it didn't echo. It vanished, like a secret. In the days that followed, there were no dramatic headlines. The press barely got a quote from the family. The funeral, held at the Church of Our Lady of Grace in Brooklyn, was guarded, muted, no photographers allowed, no eulogies made public, just black coats and long shadows on a cold October morning. Thousands came, but none spoke loud, because those who had known Carlo Gambino, truly known him, understood that silence was the truest tribute of all. And in that silence, one question remained. How did a Sicilian immigrant, silent, unassuming, almost invisible, become the most powerful criminal figure in modern American history? To answer that, we must go back, not just to Cacomo, not just to Brooklyn, but to every betrayal, every power shift, every body that dropped without a sound. The chessboard he played on wasn't made of squares and pawns. It was made of lives. And now, with the board wiped clean and the king no longer moving, we begin to trace the game he played and the world he quietly conquered. This is the story of Carlo Gambino, the boss of bosses, the man who died with his slippers on and left the world wondering how. He was born beneath the Sicilian sun, that hot, unforgiving sun that turned soil to dust and boys to men before they were ready. August 24th, 1902, Cacamo, Sicily, a town built from stone and memory. You could walk its cobbled roads and still hear the echo of horse hooves from a century earlier. It was a place where nothing was forgotten and no one truly left. The hills were steep, the olive trees sparse, and the laws that governed men did not come from courts. They came from whispered oaths and inherited debts. This was where Carlo Gambino took his first breath, in a world that taught him early what silence was worth. The family name already carried weight. The Gambinos weren't rich, but they were respected. Not in the way newspapers respected politicians, in the way a village respects those who bury their secrets without ceremony. His father, Tommaso Gambino, was quiet, strict, and known for keeping his word, the kind of man who walked through the market and was greeted without smiles, only nods. His mother, Maria, never spoke of the men who visited late or the envelopes that disappeared into their cellar. Their home was modest, 3 rooms, a low ceiling, and a crucifix that hung slightly tilted above the hearth. But it wasn't the walls that shaped Carlo, it was the codes they held. Onore, familia, omerta, honor, family, silence. These weren't just values in Cacamo, they were survival. The early 1900s in Sicily were an age of contradictions. The new Italian state had declared victory over banditry, over feudalism, over the South itself. But in truth, the government's reach stopped somewhere north of Palermo. What remained was a landscape carved by hunger and ruled by the Onorata Societa, the honored society, the early mafia, born not from greed, but from mistrust of those in power. Justice in Cacamo was personal, and it came fast. A dispute over a goat might end in blood. A glance at the wrong woman might end in exile. The priest knew which names not to say. The constable knew which crimes to overlook. And children, even the smallest ones, knew when to stop asking questions. Carlo was 6 when he saw his first knife fight. Not in a field, not in a dark alley, but in the town square beneath the chapel's bell, where 2 men argued over a debt no court would recognize. One walked away, the other did not, and Carlo didn't cry. He didn't ask. He just watched. Later, his uncle put a hand on his shoulder and said, "A man who watches lives likers than a man who speaks." That was his first lesson. It wouldn't be his last. By the time he was 10, Carlo had learned which streets to walk at dusk and which doors to knock on when his father sent him with messages. He learned not to repeat what he heard, and more importantly, not to flinch at what he saw. Older boys tested him, but Carlo wasn't the kind to fight for pride. He didn't need to. His reputation, even as a child, wasn't built on strength. It was built on stillness. There was something unsettling about the way he listened, not like a child, like a ledger. At 14, Carlo Gambino stopped going to school, not because he couldn't learn, because he'd learned enough. His education came from the men who ran Cacamo's shadows, landowners who never tilled a field, importers who never saw a part, and watchful men who lived by codes no outsider could read. He ran errands for his cousins, carrying packages, relaying messages, retrieving envelopes sealed in wax. He watched men disappear and never return. He watched feuds cool or erupt, depending on who sat at which table, and he learned that loyalty wasn't just an expectation, it was currency. By 16, he wasn't a boy running errands anymore. He was one of them. Not fully, not yet. But the door had opened. The ceremony came quietly. No witnesses, no announcements. One summer night, beneath the fig trees behind a stone villa outside of town, Gambino was pricked on the finger and sworn to silence. A small card, a saint's image, was burned in his palm, and the words of the oath were spoken in dialect older than the kingdom of Italy itself. If I betray, may I burn as this saint burns. By 19, Carlo Gambino was a uomo d'onore, a man of honor, a soldier in the Sicilian Mafia, not a killer, not yet, but a man trusted with the business of silence. He was clever, discreet, and unusually calm. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't speak more than he had to. His friends were few, his enemies were careful, and the elders, the capos who ran Western Sicily's patchwork of power, began to take notice. He was, they said, a boy born with old eyes. But old eyes saw what others didn't, and Gambino saw change coming. The early 1920s brought two storms to Sicily. One wore a uniform, the other came on a ship. In 1922, Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy. He didn't like the mafia, not because of crime, but because of control. Mussolini couldn't tolerate any rival to state power, and in Sicily, the mafia was power. In 1925, he appointed Cesare Mori as prefect of Palermo. Mori was no politician, he was a soldier. He arrived in Sicily with one mission: crush the mafia, and he did it with fire. Homes were raided, men were tortured, villages were blockaded. Mori didn't just arrest mafiosi, he humiliated them, dragged them through the streets, labeled them enemies of the state. In Cacamo, fear returned to men who had never known it. Carlo watched the old guard crumble. Some fled to Naples, some went underground, some were buried in shallow graves, but Carlo didn't wait for the knock on his door. He had already chosen a different path. In the spring of 1921, he said goodbye to his mother with a kiss on the forehead and a suitcase no heavier than a loaf of bread. The port of Palermo was crowded with families, laborers, and men like him, men whose futures didn't belong to Italy anymore. They were bound for Argentina, Brazil, New York. Carlo's ticket said Napoli, New York, steerage class. He traveled under the name Charles Gambino. No fanfare, no farewell, just the Mediterranean behind him and the Atlantic ahead. He arrived in New York weeks later, alone, 20 years old, no English, no connections, at least not the kind written on paper. But his last name mattered, and so did the codes he carried. He entered America not as a beggar, but as a student of power. Ellis Island in the 1920s was a place of chaos and cataloging. Immigrants were inspected like livestock. Names were shortened or misspelled. Languages clashed in every corridor. Carlo said little. He answered what he had to. His documents said laborer. His eyes said otherwise. Within days, he was in Brooklyn, a borough swelling with Sicilian faces, crowded tenements, and a new kind of underworld. It was not the same as Sicily, but the bones were familiar, and he would learn the rest. Carlo took a job on the docks, carrying crates of fruit and barrels of olive oil. Legal work by day, observations by night. He watched the unions, watched who got paid first, watched who walked in silence and who talked too much. He found his cousins, men already working with the Castellano family, a small but rising name in the outer boroughs. He was welcomed, cautiously. America had made many men reckless, but Carlo wasn't reckless. He never drank after sunset, never gambled on Sundays, never carried a gun without a reason. He listened more than he spoke, and just like in Sicily, his silence was noticed. In less than a year, he was trusted with small runs, deliveries, quiet messages, low-level collections. He was never flashy. While others bragged about new suits and corner girls, Carlo returned home early, cooked his own meals, and read American newspapers with a dictionary beside him. He understood instinctively what others missed. This new country didn't reward noise, it punished it, and power here would not come from fear alone. It would come from patience, strategy, discretion. In Brooklyn's underworld, Blood earned respect, but silence earned longevity, and Gambino didn't want to be feared for a moment. He wanted to endure. By 1923, he was a quiet fixture in the Sicilian underworld of Brooklyn. He never made a scene, never lost control. He had no record, no arrest photos, no known vices. But inside the rooms that mattered, his name began to mean something, not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't betray, he didn't panic, he didn't speak out of turn. And slowly, the American Mafia, still fragmented, still tribal, still bloody, began to see in him something rare. A man who had crossed an ocean not to escape a past, but to perfect it. That boy from Cacamo, born beneath the crucifix and the silence, was no longer a child of Sicily. He was now a student of Brooklyn, but the codes had not changed, and he would never break them, not for money, not for power, not for anyone, because the world he was building wasn't for those who shouted, it was for those who watched and waited. Brooklyn, 1923. The borough didn't sleep. It brooded, from the East River docks to the alleys behind Carroll Street. The air buzzed with ambition, desperation, and the scent of hot brick and cold iron. Ships rolled into port, with crates labeled olive oil, lemons, Sicilian wine, but inside, packed beneath false bottoms, was the real cargo. Heroin from Marseille, bootleg whiskey from Canada, pistols without serials. And men, thousands of them, chasing power in a city still learning what to do with it. This was the Brooklyn Carlo Gambino stepped into, but he didn't charge through the front door. He drifted in through the cracks. No headlines, no heat, no one quite remembered when he arrived, only that, slowly, he was there. They called men like Dutch Schultz glamour gangsters. Suits that glinted under gaslight, cars with custom plates, machine guns that barked on busy streets. Carlo was the opposite. He didn't gamble in public, didn't show up to nightclubs with arm candy and cigars. If he spoke in a crowd, it was never above a whisper. If he met you, you remembered his eyes, not what they said, but what they didn't need to. In the thick of the Prohibition years, as New York became a maze of speakeasies, illegal stills, and corrupt beat cops, Gambino wasn't making noise. He was making introductions. His cousins, the Castellanos, were running small bootlegging operations out of Bay Ridge. Simple routes, small crews, reliable profits. When Gambino joined them, he didn't ask to be in charge. He didn't try to take over. He simply made things smoother. Shipments arrived faster, collections became cleaner, competitors, or at least the loud ones, stopped showing up altogether, and slowly, the Castellanos stopped calling the shots. Because Gambino, without raising his hand, had already started to steer the wheel. The New York underworld of the 1920s was still tribal. Irish ran Hell's Kitchen. Jews controlled gambling syndicates along the East River. Italians, Sicilians especially, stayed in enclaves, watched each other closely, and didn't trust anyone too quickly. But Prohibition had changed the rules. With alcohol outlawed in 1920, every neighborhood, every city, became an open wound of opportunity. Booze wasn't just profitable, it was essential, and the men who controlled it could print money from warehouses full of Canadian rye and copper stills hidden in Bronx basements. Gambino saw the map shifting, and he knew he'd need more than family ties to win this game. So he did what very few Sicilian gangsters dared to do in those years. He made friends outside the tribe. Meyer Lansky was 20 when Gambino first heard his name. A Jewish kid from the Lower East Side with a mathematical mind and a gift for systems. He didn't shoot fast, but he thought 3 moves ahead. Luciano, Charles, Lucky Luciano, had already begun to rise too. A Sicilian like Carlo, but younger, bolder, and more willing to defy the old rules. Most men older than Carlo distrusted them, called them reckless, disloyal, too eager to work across lines that had always divided New York's gangs. But Gambino saw something else. He saw the future. He began appearing, never loudly, never frequently, at meetings organized by Lansky. Talks about territory, Union infiltration, and pooled shipments. He rarely spoke, but when he did, men leaned in. He didn't offer opinions, he offered solutions, and that made him invaluable. By 1925, while men like Dutch Schultz were building empires with bullets, Gambino was doing something subtler. He was studying, not maps, not money, people. He watched how men rose. More importantly, he watched how they fell. He learned that betrayal didn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it came with silence. He watched bosses who drank too much start saying as much. Watched lieutenants who craved attention get attention from the wrong people. Watched soldiers who demanded respect end up with bullets in their throats. Gambino didn't demand respect. He invited it by being the only one in the room who never needed to speak first. He dressed simply, pressed shirts, black wool coats in winter, modest hats, no rings, no chains. His shoes were always clean. He still lived in a walk-up in Bensonhurst. 2 rooms, a modest kitchen, a view of the alley. The neighbors never heard arguing, never saw visitors after dark. His landlady said he was courteous, quiet, and paid in cash. To most, he was just another immigrant working the docks. But in truth, Gambino was building a network, one whisper at a time. He paid attention to the things others ignored. The accountant, who skimmed 5% off a heroin deal, gone. The butcher, who spoke out of turn in a gambling den, warned once, then disappeared. The courier, who flirted with the wrong wife, reassigned to a route no one talked about again. And yet there was no violence in his wake, no bodies in trunks, no police raids tied to his name. Everything he did left no scent. That was the brilliance of it. That was the terror of it. You didn't know he was there until it was too late to matter. In 1927, a federal task force raided a warehouse in Red Hook, seizing 37 barrels of bonded scotch. Half the city's underworld scrambled to clean house. Names leaked, territory shifted, and yet, through it all, Gambino's operation remained untouched. Not one man flipped, not one shipment was rerouted. His deliveries kept moving. One federal agent, in a private report, scribbled next to Gambino's name, "No exposure, no leverage, no case." And that became the refrain. No exposure, no leverage, no case. Gambino was a ghost. But ghosts don't build power alone. They need disciples. And Gambinos came to him, one by one, not with pledges, but with obedience. He began mentoring younger men. Quiet ones, smart ones, the kind who didn't crave newspaper ink. He taught them how to blend in, how to listen more than speak, how to move money without leaving fingerprints. He built what others couldn't, a culture, a way of being, the Gambino way. By the end of the decade, the Castellanos were still officially in charge, but inside the rooms that mattered, the back offices of Italian restaurants in Gravesend, the side tables at Union bars in Bay Ridge, men deferred to Carlo. Not because he asked, but because the room tilted toward him, like gravity. No one could say when it happened. But by 1929, everyone knew. Carlo Gambino was no longer in the game. He was shaping it. There's a photograph, grainy, barely legible, from a 1930 wedding in Williamsburg. A dozen men at a long table, bottles of red wine, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. Most of the faces are loud, laughing, leaning in, shouting above the jazz band in the next room, except for one. At the end of the table, half-shadowed, head slightly turned, eyes watching everything, Carlo Gambino. No one remembers who the groom was, but everyone remembers he was there. Years later, when investigators would try to piece together his early years in New York, how he'd risen, who he'd killed, what laws he'd broken. They would run into the same wall over and over. No surveillance, no photographs, no wiretaps, no witnesses, only shadows. And when they'd ask old-timers in the neighborhood about him, they'd always get the same response. Carlo, he was quiet, always quiet. And then, after a pause, they'd add, but nothing moved unless he let it. The East River was still the morning they found Philip Mangano. April 1951, spring hadn't arrived yet in New York. The water was bone cold and gray, coated in thin oil streaks from the tugs and ferries that chugged across it daily. It was a Tuesday when two dock workers spotted something floating near the edge of the pier in Sheepshead Bay. At first glance, it could have been driftwood, but when it rolled toward shore, face up, the silence broke. Philip Mangano, brother of Vincent Mangano, head of one of New York's 5 families, was dead. 2 bullets to the back of the head, weighted ankles, suits soaked, neck twisted, shoes still polished. Vincent, his older brother, had vanished entirely. No one claimed to have seen him. No one claimed to have heard anything. But every man who mattered knew. Albert Anastasia had just made his move, and Carlo Gambino, who had once sworn allegiance to the Mangano family, didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. He didn't mourn, because he already knew. He had known for months, and more importantly, he had chosen a side. To understand that moment, you have to go back nearly 20 years, back to the mid-1930s, back to the height of Prohibition's wreckage, and the early tremors of something more organized taking shape. Gambino, still in his early 30s, had quietly embedded himself deeper into New York's underworld. The Castellano family, his original base, was folding itself under the larger umbrella of Vincent Mangano's crime family. Mangano was one of the original 5, appointed when Lucky Luciano formed the commission in 1931. He was old school, Sicilian, traditional, careful with boundaries, but even back then, there were cracks. Because standing just behind Vincent, in the shadow he tried to ignore, was Albert Anastasia. Anastasia wasn't like the others. Born in Calabria, just across the strait from Sicily, he had arrived in America as a stowaway. He'd worked the docks, hard, fast, and without fear. They called him the Mad Hatter for a reason. He didn't speak much, but when he acted, it was with terrifying clarity. By the mid-30s, Anastasia had carved out his role as the operational head of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the Mafia, used by bosses across the country to solve problems that couldn't be solved with negotiation. He ran it like a ghost army. Killers on payroll, orders delivered without names, hits carried out with clinical silence. Over the course of just a few years, Anastasia's network was suspected in over 400 murders, though none of them could be traced back to him. Gambino watched this with cold detachment. He wasn't a killer like Albert. He didn't glorify blood, but he understood utility. He understood momentum, and he saw something dangerous growing between Vincent Mangano and his own underboss. It wasn't just rivalry, it was decay. By the early 1940s, Mangano was growing paranoid. Anastasia had too much power. He took too many meetings without permission. He received too much deference from capos that Mangano expected to answer to him. And worse, Anastasia had begun to ally himself with the likes of Frank Costello and Luciano, men Vincent didn't trust. But while Mangano fumed, Gambino listened. He continued to operate beneath the surface, building influence in Brooklyn's docks, strengthening ties with Sicilian elders, and managing lucrative gambling operations in the outer boroughs. He didn't side openly with either man. He didn't express opinions in meetings. But behind the curtain, he began to inch closer to Anastasia. He visited him at the docks, shared meals with his soldiers, took assignments from him without protest. Some said it was survival, Others said it was a slow burn betrayal. But Gambino didn't think in those terms. He thought in math, in consequences and returns. Vincent Mangano was the past. Albert Anastasia was the storm. But storms don't last forever, and Gambino was already thinking about what comes after. In the final year of Vincent Mangano's life, the tension was unbearable. He and Anastasia weren't even pretending anymore. Mangano would issue orders. Anastasia would ignore them. Capos were forced to choose sides. The family was fracturing, not with violence yet, but with silence. And Gambino? He started counting votes, not literally, but in the language of the commission. Leadership was as much about perception as power. Every boss needed a consensus, a sense of inevitability behind him. Gambino made quiet calls, tested allegiances, measured who leaned which way and how far. He played the middle in public, but privately, his cards were marked. And then came April 1951. Vincent Mangano left home in the morning. No one saw him again. His car was found abandoned in Red Hook, doors locked, keys still in the ignition. No note, no blood, no witness. His brother Philip, as we've said, surfaced soon after, bloated and broken, his body dragged from the water by men who weren't paid to care. The message couldn't have been clearer, and yet, when Albert Anastasia called an emergency meeting with his remaining captains, there was no outrage, only acceptance, only silence. And at Anastasia's side, standing just a step behind the throne, Carlo Gambino. Anastasia now had the top seat. He controlled one of the 5 families outright, and with Costello and Luciano's quiet backing, he tightened his grip with a violence that made even longtime wise guys flinch. His nickname, Lord High Executioner, wasn't a joke. He lived up to it. Enemies didn't just vanish. They were butchered, bodies found in hallways, bathtubs, train yards. Blood was his language. He believed in fear. Gambino watched this with growing caution. He remained loyal, outwardly. He took his orders, attended the weddings, nodded when he was supposed to. But something had shifted, not just in Anastasia, in the atmosphere around him. The other bosses began to pull back. Even Costello kept his distance. There was something unsteady in Anastasia's approach. Not reckless exactly, but impulsive. He didn't just want to be respected, he wanted to be feared. He believed blood bought loyalty. Gambino believed the opposite. Blood made debts, and eventually, those debts had to be paid. In private, Gambino began to rewire his loyalties, not with declarations, with gestures, quiet support for underbosses who opposed Anastasia's extremism, cautious alliances with families looking for stability. He spoke to Luciano in Havana. He spoke to Vito Genovese in whispers. He was building a bridge, not to power, but to permission. Because to remove a boss, even one as volatile as Anastasia, you needed more than motive. You needed the commission's nod. You needed consensus. And Gambino, more than anyone, knew how to read a room. In one rare conversation, recalled decades later by a soldier named Anthony Tony Batts La Scala, Gambino once said of Anastasia, "You can fear a man with a knife, but a man with a mirror, he fears himself, and he sees enemies in every reflection." Anastasia was unraveling. The FBI was getting louder. Arrests were climbing. His public image, once invisible, had started to leak. The press dubbed him the executioner. Politicians called for investigations. Even within his own ranks, there was unrest. And Gambino stayed patient, because he knew storms don't last. But those who plant seeds beneath them, they survive. By 1957, Gambino had waited long enough. He had never raised his voice, never pulled a trigger in public. But his influence, slow, invisible, disciplined, had shaped the moment perfectly. Albert Anastasia would fall, and Carlo Gambino would not only survive it, he would emerge untouched. But that's a story for another day. For now, we close on this truth. The cost of loyalty in the underworld isn't paid in money, it's paid in silence, strategy, and knowing exactly when to stop standing behind a man so the knife can go in clean. The mirror never screamed, it only reflected. October 25th, 1957, the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan sat quietly between business and violence, a stone monument on 56th Street that catered to politicians, wealthy travelers, and men who carried secrets in the seams of their coats. On the ground floor, tucked just beyond the lobby, was the hotel barbershop. Clean, private, familiar. Albert Anastasia walked in at 10:15 a.m. He wasn't late. He was never late. Wearing a navy overcoat, dark pinstripe suit, and a crisp shirt open at the collar, he entered without ceremony. His bodyguard, Anthony Coppola, dropped him off at the curb, then drove to park the car, a habit, not a mistake. Inside, Anastasia greeted the barber by name. He hung his coat neatly, then he took his seat. It was chair number 4. The barber draped a white cloth over his chest and fastened it behind his neck. Anastasia tilted his head back, eyes half closed, and stared into the mirror. He never saw them coming. 2 men burst in, faces covered, guns drawn. They didn't hesitate. They didn't speak. The first shot shattered the mirror. The next 5 tore through flesh and bone, chest, neck, jaw, shoulder, skull. Anastasia fell forward, arms swinging wildly, as if trying to fight shadows. The chair spun once, slowly, before his body hit the floor. Blood pooled on the marble tile, staining the towel still tucked around his neck. The man who had run Murder, Inc., the Lord High Executioner, was executed in a barber's chair before he could blink. And just like that, New York shifted. The killing made headlines instantly. The New York Times called it an execution of cinematic brutality. Photographs showed shattered glass, spent casings, a pair of broken sunglasses lying near the doorway. Crowds gathered outside the hotel, whispering names they didn't dare say out loud. No one claimed responsibility. No arrests were made. No witnesses stepped forward. But inside the underworld, no one had to ask. Everyone already knew. Carlo Gambino had struck, not with bullets, but with balance. It was a move not of anger, but of precision. The culmination of a plan 3 years in the making, a quiet coup hidden inside a violent act. He hadn't been at the scene, he hadn't pulled the trigger, but everything that followed belonged to him. Anastasia had ruled with fear, but fear is volatile. It doesn't build loyalty. It only buys silence until someone else pays more. And by 1957, the costs of Albert's violence had grown too high. He killed without permission. He insulted other bosses. He ignored the rules of the commission. His men had grown restless. His allies had gone quiet. And Gambino, always watching, always waiting, understood that true power didn't come from domination. It came from permission. He began gathering that permission in whispers. A word with Meyer Lansky, a quiet nod from Frank Costello, a conversation with Vito Genovese, who saw in Albert a rival and in Carlo a tool. Even Lucky Luciano, exiled in Italy, gave his blessing. The old world had grown tired of chaos. They wanted a man who didn't need to shout. Gambino never asked them to approve the hit. He just let them know they wouldn't need to stop it. After Anastasia's death, the underworld braced for war. But there was none, because Gambino's plan had anticipated every piece on the board. Frank Costello, the aging diplomat of the Mafia, quietly stepped back, citing health. Vito Genovese, thinking himself the architect of the power shift, moved to take credit. But Gambino didn't argue. He let Vito speak, let him enjoy the spotlight. While behind the scenes, one family, his family, grew stronger than any other. Gambino didn't hold a press conference. He didn't install himself in Anastasia's chair. He simply began hosting the meetings. He moved money, he placed men, he absorbed territories, and within months, the Mangano Anastasia family had a new identity. It became the Gambino crime family, not because he named it that, but because everyone else did. The crown had passed without a coronation, because the crown, in his world, was made of silence, not gold. It was the largest of the 5 families, and it didn't just run numbers and loan sharking. It ran the ports, it ran the unions, it ran contracts no politician dared trace. Under Gambino, the family became less about blood and more about structure. He wasn't interested in ego, he was interested in results. He didn't want headlines, he wanted leverage. He discouraged flashy suits, warned against unnecessary killings. He told his men, never let them know what room you're in. And they listened, because in the wake of Anastasia's death, no one questioned who held the reins. The chair and the mirror became symbols, whispered, feared, mythologized. You could walk into any bar in Bensonhurst, drop the date October 25th, and silence would follow. Even decades later, wise guys would lower their voices when recalling it. Not because they were afraid of ghosts, but because they knew that in that one violent morning, everything had changed. A reign built on rage had been replaced by a rule built on restraint, and the man behind it didn't need to stand in front of cameras or bodies. He just needed to be obeyed. Carlo Gambino had done what few men in the mafia ever managed. He had removed a king, not with force, but with gravity. He had taken power, not by rising, but by allowing others to fall. And he had done it the same way he had done everything since the day he stepped off the boat in 1921. Quietly, carefully, completely. The mirror never screamed, but long after the glass was swept up, it kept reflecting what men feared most. That the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one with the gun. It's the one who no longer needs one. The woods that morning were still. Cold air pressed down on the trees like a quiet warning. It was November 14th, 1957, upstate New York, the kind of place where secrets weren't supposed to be kept because there was no one around to keep them. A small town called Appalachian. Population, fewer than 500, miles from the city. No noise, no eyes, just empty roads and cracked frost. Inside a sprawling hilltop estate, owned by mob associate Joseph Barbara, something was brewing. Dozens of Cadillacs and Chryslers had begun to arrive the night before. Men in suits, soft shoes, shaved jaws, names that the newspapers whispered but never confirmed. Vito Genovese, Joseph Bonanno, Santo Trafficante, Tommy Lucchese, and somewhere among them, not at the head table, not drawing attention, was Carlo Gambino. It was supposed to be discreet, a meeting to reorganize, to smooth tensions, to crown new hierarchies in the aftermath of Anastasia's murder and Costello's quiet retreat. But at 11:15 a.m., 2 state troopers noticed something strange. Luxury cars with out-of-state plates parked outside of a home that should have been empty. They called it in. By noon, the estate was surrounded. The Appalachian Conference, the most secretive gathering of American mob power in history, had become a trap. What followed was chaos. Mobsters scattered like smoke into the woods. Dozens sprinted through hedges, ditches, and fields in finely tailored suits, slipping on frost-covered grass. Some tossed their coats. Others dropped cash as they ran. A few made it back to their cars, tires spinning in the gravel as they peeled off. Others weren't so lucky. The state police arrested 58 men that afternoon. The FBI, who hadn't even known the meeting was happening, arrived late and humiliated. Inside the estate, untouched bowls of cold cuts and glasses of Chianti sat on linen-covered tables. Cigarette smoke still hung in the air. In the fireplace, ashes glowed beneath a half-burned ledger. Outside, cameras began to click. And Carlo Gambino, he didn't run. He walked, calmly and alone through the front gate. Jacket buttoned, eyes lowered, not hurried, not even concerned. When a trooper stopped him and asked his name, he offered it. He was, he said, visiting a sick friend. They let him go. The Appalachian raid shattered a myth. Until that day, the government had denied the existence of a nationwide criminal syndicate. They called it folklore, fiction, a convenient scapegoat. Now, in one raid, state troopers had pulled back the curtain. Men from every corner of the underworld, New York, Chicago, Florida, Detroit, even Havana, had all appeared in the same place, and they hadn't come for the cold cuts. The press exploded, mob conference busted, underworld summit exposed, FBI caught off guard. But in the eye of the storm, Gambino didn't speak. Not to the press, not to the police, not even to the men arrested that day. Because he didn't need to. Within weeks, the ripple effects began. Senate hearings, grand juries, a new generation of lawmen emboldened by Appalachian's blunder. Names were subpoenaed, alliances questioned, entire families fell under scrutiny. But Gambino, as he had always done, drifted through the smoke untouched. He hadn't chaired the meeting. He hadn't signed his name in any guest book. He hadn't run. And most of all, he hadn't needed to say a word. His presence at Appalachian had confirmed his status, but his survival of it had sealed his legend. In the months that followed, while others scrambled to plug leaks and dodge indictments, Gambino did something different. He slowed down. He became even quieter. He retreated into structure, discipline, and shadows. He didn't meet in hotels anymore. He met in back rooms of butcher shops, on benches, in Bensonhurst parks, in kitchens with no phones, at tables with no names. He began embedding his power into places the law couldn't see, not brothels, not dice rooms, but unions, shipping, construction. He turned his attention to the long game, not extortion, but infrastructure. He took control of the International Longshoremen's Association, slipping trusted men into leadership positions. He had no official title, no payroll signature, but he controlled who loaded the ships, who moved the crates, which shipments left port, and which sat for weeks until someone paid. New York's harbors, the arteries of America's economy, now pulsed in rhythm with his command. He extended his reach into the garment industry, the meatpacking unions, the concrete business, garbage collection, airport trucking, from Midtown skyscrapers to Staten Island landfills. A web of invisible influence began to take shape, and at the center of that web was a man no one could ever quite catch. FBI agents would spend the next decade trying to unravel it. They bugged payphones, tracked license plates, hounded low-level couriers. But Gambino's world didn't work like that. He never spoke on the phone, never carried a ledger, never made threats. He smiled, nodded, and let others do the talking and the bleeding. He had lieutenants who handled disputes, capos who gave orders, buffers who served as ghosts between him and the street. To the Bureau, it was infuriating. To the Commission, it was genius. There's a story, told years later by an agent named Don Hines, about a surveillance team staking out Gambino's modest home in Massapequa. They watched for weeks, tracked his routine, waited for him to slip. But he didn't. He took walks at the same time every morning. He tended to his garden in silence. He drove to church on Sundays. No visitors came unannounced. No packages ever changed hands. Hines said, "It was like watching a retired professor prune roses. Only we knew he ran half the city." That was Carlo's brilliance. He understood what Appalachian had revealed and what it had threatened. Power was no longer about territory. It was about camouflage, about embedding your influence so deeply that removing it would mean tearing out the city's veins. While others rebuilt after the raid, Gambino expanded, carefully, quietly, and without drawing heat. He placed relatives in unions. He married off nieces to loyal soldiers. He hosted family dinners, not sit-downs. He gave gifts, not orders. And slowly, the image of a crime boss shifted from the loud, cigar-smoking tyrant to something else entirely, a man who moved beneath notice. Appalachian had been a fire. It burned hot, it burned quick, and it exposed the men who thought they could rule in daylight. Gambino never tried to rule in daylight. He had no interest in parades, in titles, in the illusion of control. He was after something far more durable, influence without visibility. And in that goal, Appalachian hadn't been a setback. It had been a signal, because in a single afternoon, every rival had shown their face, every federal agency had overreached, and every man in that room, including Vito Genovese, who had arranged the conference hoping to declare himself king, had taken a hit. Except one, the man who walked out calmly, who said nothing, who smiled politely, and stepped into his car. Carlo Gambino didn't just survive Appalachian, he learned from it, and then he rewrote the rules of power. It was the kind of power no one could point to directly. No crown, no throne, no oath read aloud. But if you lived in New York in the 1960s, if you built its skyscrapers, docked its ships, ran its freight, or tried to make a deal above the third floor, then you already knew Carlo Gambino ran the city, and he did it from a modest brick home in Massapequa, Long Island, a quiet cul-de-sac, a trimmed lawn, two-car driveway, curtains drawn, no plaques, no guards, no gates. Inside, the furniture was conservative, the meals were simple, the voices, when heard at all, were soft. But make no mistake, that house was a palace, because behind its quiet walls, Gambino held the strings of an empire built not on blood, but on balance. He wore wool suits in gray and black, always pressed, never loud. His shoes shined, but not too much. He kept his tie knots small. His hands still bore the calluses of a dock worker, but his eyes, deep-set, unreadable, saw everything. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to, because if he was speaking to you, you were already being warned. By 1962, Carlo Gambino had transformed a fractured criminal network into the most sophisticated organized syndicate in American history. The Gambino crime family, now fully under his name, boasted more than 500 made men and thousands of associates. Its influence stretched from Brooklyn to Miami, from garment factories in Queens to freight yards in Newark. The numbers were staggering: $100 million a year in heroin trafficking, millions more siphoned from dock worker kickbacks. Control over the ILA, International Longshoremen's Association, which dictated the flow of goods through the port of New York, then the busiest in the world. And yet, he was invisible. Gambino didn't leave fingerprints on deals. He left no paper trail. He didn't sign ledgers. He didn't carry a gun. What he carried was weight, a gravity so complete that even judges, union leaders, and senators bent subtly in his direction, sometimes without knowing why. His base of power wasn't built in neon or casinos. It was built in structure, quiet, layered, disciplined. Every operation had 3 degrees of separation. Every message passed through trusted intermediaries. Every transaction coded. If a man slipped up, he wasn't scolded. He was removed, silently, without spectacle. He had 2 rules for those close to him. Don't get caught. Don't make noise. Men who forgot that found themselves replaced, not because they failed, but because they risked exposure. And to Gambino, exposure was death. He refused to be photographed. He gave no interviews. When he appeared in public, it was always in controlled spaces, funerals, weddings, Sunday Mass. He moved through neighborhoods not like a ghost, but like a myth, known by all, seen by few, spoken about only in rooms with the curtains closed. Inside the organization, His presence was defined not by proximity, but by effect. You didn't need him in the room to feel him there. Capos who fought too loudly suddenly found themselves reassigned. Contracts signed without his implicit nod quietly dissolved. Territories that drifted too far from the family line were gently or violently corrected. It was management by presence without appearance, and it worked. Even the law struggled to define him. J. Edgar Hoover had been forced to admit the mafia existed after the Appalachian debacle. A new generation of federal agents, armed with wiretaps, surveillance vans, and undercover informants, had taken aim at the five families. They had stacks of evidence on men like Tommy Lucchese and Joe Colombo. They had pictures of Paul Castellano and tapes on Vito Genovese. But Carlo, nothing stuck. FBI agents tailed him for years. They recorded hours of car rides, church visits, garden walks. He never said a word. One agent, in a memo from 1966, wrote, "Mr. Gambino is either the most disciplined man in organized crime or a myth his subordinates have created." The truth was simpler. Gambino was disciplined, and myths didn't terrify federal prosecutors. He did. He didn't live in the city's spotlight, but its pulse beat from his fingertips. When the garment district needed peace between rival trucking outfits, it was Gambino who sent the message that ended the sabotage. When politicians wanted union support for re-election, they quietly asked intermediaries tied to his crew. When a nightclub opened in Midtown and refused to pay protection, the liquor license vanished. And when a judge ruled against one of Gambino's interests, the judge's brother, a contractor, lost 3 city bids the following week. No one traced it. No one needed to. The message was clear. You didn't have to see the king to know he ruled. Behind closed doors, Gambino ruled not with ego, but with memory. He remembered slights. He remembered names. He remembered who showed up early and who left before dessert. He conducted business at his kitchen table, never after sunset. Conversations never lasted more than 30 minutes. No notes were taken. No second chances were given. Men who dined with him recall the silence between words, how a single raised eyebrow meant more than any threat. He rarely complimented. He never cursed. But if he placed a hand on your shoulder, you'd carry that weight for a lifetime. Inside the family, succession was always a question. Power attracts ambition, and ambition attracts betrayal. But Gambino, ever methodical, worked to prevent war before it started. He kept his relatives close. His cousin, Paul Castellano, a businessman with clean suits and a quiet tongue, began handling more operations, construction bids, food unions, concrete companies. Castellano didn't have the respect of street soldiers, but he had Gambino's trust. Others rumbled, but none dared challenge it, because even as power centralized, the old man stayed alert. He held weekly updates from his capos. He reviewed reports, never on paper, only in person, and he kept a list in his head of who could rise and who had to fall. In public, Gambino appeared fragile. He walked slower, his shoulders hunched. His voice, always quiet, grew thinner with age. But behind those tired eyes, the machine kept turning. He still controlled the heroin routes from Turkey through the French Connection pipeline. He still brokered ceasefires between rival families before bodies hit the sidewalk. He still ensured that city contracts, from sanitation to scaffolding, flowed through companies he had buried men to protect. To the public, he was a recluse. To law enforcement, a riddle. But to the underworld, he remained what he had always been. The man you feared disappointing more than you feared dying. His wealth, vast though never flaunted, moved in silence. No Swiss accounts, no gold rings, no fur coats, or fleets of Cadillacs. He preferred cash in safes. Shell companies in Panama. A quiet cut from every port shipment, garment invoice, and union pension. And he kept enough in envelopes to settle scores, fund favors, or disappear a problem before it started. His house never had security cameras. He trusted loyalty, not steel, because a man who has to be protected has already lost control. Gambino never needed protection. He was the protection. By the end of the 1960s, Carlo Gambino stood at the top of the American underworld, not loudly, not ceremonially, but absolutely. The politicians he needed answered their phones. The judges he disliked retired early. The rivals who doubted him vanished, sometimes into other cities, sometimes into graves. And the city, the whole twisted, glittering, roaring machine, kept moving forward, unaware of the man pulling its wires from a quiet street in Massapequa. There are no photographs of him smiling, none that show him laughing, only stillness, only eyes. Because to run an empire like his, you didn't need charisma, you needed restraint, and restraint is the rarest currency in a world built on greed. Carlo Gambino never wore gold on his wrists. He wore it in his reach. He didn't live like a king, but he died as one. Because the man who rules longest isn't the one who burns brightest. It's the one who stays standing long after everyone else has run out of fire. It was said that you couldn't follow a shadow, but in the 1960s and 70s, the FBI tried. They sat for hours outside a modest home in Massapequa, watching a man in his 60s walk his lawn with a rake, or sip espresso beneath a sycamore in the back garden. They documented his steps, the brand of his shoes, the license plates of every car that passed. They heard nothing, saw nothing, learned nothing, but they kept coming, because the man in that house, the one who trimmed hedges on Sundays and fed pigeons in silence, was running the most powerful criminal syndicate in American history. Carlo Gambino, the ghost J. Edgar Hoover couldn't catch. The war between the FBI and organized crime didn't begin in a courtroom. It began with humiliation. Appalachian had made the Bureau look foolish. For decades, Hoover refused to even acknowledge that a national crime network existed, but now the world had seen it, in photographs, in mugshots, in headlines. Suddenly, organized crime wasn't a theory, it was a threat, and Hoover, stung by embarrassment, declared war. He created new task forces, issued a stream of internal memos, deployed agents with tape recorders, long lenses, and telephoto cameras. Dozens of mafia figures were targeted: Joe Colombo, Sam Giancana, Vincent Gigante, Angelo Bruno. Some were indicted, others were gunned down, still others flipped, revealing networks that spanned from City Hall to Havana. But one name remained stubbornly out of reach: Gambino. The problem wasn't just that Gambino was careful, it was that he had always been careful. While other bosses built empires through violence or bravado, Gambino built a culture of silence. There were no phones in his inner circle, no tape recordings, no bank accounts that tied back to him, no homes registered in his name. He refused to speak in parked cars, refused to meet outside his trusted locations. He used hand gestures more than words. He sent messages through 3 layers of people, each of whom could be trusted not to know too much. And when he did speak, it was brief, precise, deliberate. One former associate would later say, "You could sit with the old man for an hour and leave not knowing what he asked for, only knowing what you had to do." The Bureau grew desperate. Agents trailed him for years. They photographed him leaving church. They listened to him order pasta in Italian. They rifled through garbage from his relatives' homes. They placed bugs in restaurants, florist shops, even in the confessionals of certain churches in Bensonhurst. But still, nothing. One agent, Don Hines, described the experience like trying to nail fog to a wall. Everywhere Gambino went, the space bent around him. He knew who was watching. He knew which cars were federal. He even made jokes about it, once waving at an FBI van parked near his cousin's wake, but he never acknowledged it, because attention, in his world, was a debt you couldn't afford to pay. The 1970s brought new tools to the FBI's arsenal. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, allowed prosecutors to charge mafia leaders for crimes committed by their subordinates. It meant bosses no longer needed to pull the trigger themselves. If their crew killed a man, the boss could go down with them. And it worked. Under RICO, dozens of capos, consiglieres, and made men were taken down. Long trials, sweeping indictments, informants entered witness protection and testified from behind mirrored glass. But not Gambino, because he never touched anything. No phone calls, no direct orders, no handwriting. Every message was verbal, spoken quietly, and only once, even when Paul Castellano, his cousin and eventual successor, began to modernize operations with ledgers and business fronts, Gambino refused. He said, "Paper is for the dead. We are not dead." But the FBI didn't stop. They watched his family, his doctors, his drivers. They leaned on old associates. They froze bank accounts of peripheral businesses. They even tried turning low-level members into rats. Some flipped, but none had enough on him. One man, caught with heroin shipments linked to Sicilian roots, told agents, "I worked with 5 capos and 2 underbosses. Not once did I meet the old man." It wasn't protection, it was design. Gambino didn't hide from the law. He built a world where the law could never find him. He began to play chess with the system. When trials reached too close, he faked illness. Doctors confirmed a weak heart. He was seen with oxygen tanks and walking canes. At one court hearing, he arrived leaning heavily on his nephew's arm, coughing into a cloth. But an agent who followed him the next week saw him walking briskly through his garden. No cane, no tank. He used time like a weapon, delaying, distracting, draining resources. By the time most investigations came close, the players had already changed. One prosecutor famously quipped, "It's like trying to catch a ghost who edits his own police file." Internally, even other bosses respected and feared him. They joked that Gambino could make a judge recuse himself with a look, that he once had a man removed from a union without saying his name. But behind the myth was a man terrified of exposure. He never stayed in one place too long. He never let people into his private rooms. He had no close friendships outside his bloodline. Even his grandchildren were raised to never ask questions. His was a life of discipline, not indulgence, because indulgence left trails. Yet for all this, he was not without feeling. In private moments, those few who served him loyally said he spoke with weight, not in grand speeches, but in regret. He often said, "Power comes with a timer. You never hear it ticking, but when it stops, you're either in prison or in dirt." He feared both, and so, in his final years, he receded even further. Meetings became rarer, instructions became shorter, the circle around him narrowed to only the most essential. And through it all, the FBI kept waiting, kept watching, kept failing. In 1972, after nearly 2 decades of pursuit, a senior agent in New York filed a memo to Washington that read, "Gambino remains the most effective, untouchable boss of all. No contact, no exposure, no leverage." It wasn't a resignation, it was an admission that the man they called boss of bosses, the quiet old man who read Sicilian newspapers and fed birds, had beaten them not by force, but by never being where they were looking. He didn't run from the law, he simply never stood still long enough to be seen. Carlo Gambino was a ghost the government spent 30 years chasing, and when they finally closed the file, when the last surveillance photograph was tucked into a cabinet drawer, there was still no recording, no transcript, no signed order, no testimony, only a name that never left the FBI's lips without frustration. Because in a world of bugs, wires, taps, and traitors, Gambino had built something no one could ever wiretap, a life made entirely of shadows. The house was quiet. It always was. Late afternoon sun poured through the front windows of Carlo Gambino's Long Island home, pooling gold over the edge of a glass ashtray and across the linen of a dining room untouched by noise. A single envelope sat on the table. Inside, a name, already decided, a name that would split a family not with bullets, not yet, but with something more dangerous: resentment. Because Carlo Gambino, the quiet king of the American underworld, had made a choice, and for the first time in 5 decades, the choice wasn't obvious. It wasn't even popular. He had named his successor, not his underboss, not his oldest ally, but his nephew, Paul Castellano. On the surface, the decision made sense. Castellano wasn't just family. He was a businessman, a strategist. He understood construction, unions, bookmaking, supply routes. He dressed the part, talked the part. Carlo saw in him a legacy of quiet control, built not on violence, but on influence. And influence, by 1971, was the only thing Carlo trusted. He was aging, slower on his walks, quieter in his meetings. The heart problems were getting worse. He needed someone who could preserve what he'd built, not expand it, not set it on fire. And Paul, with his pressed suits and ledgers and soft voice, represented continuity. But there was a problem. His name was Agnello Della Croce, and in the streets, in the dark alleys and crowded back rooms, where loyalty had always meant survival, he was the true heir. Della Croce had been with Gambino for decades. A soldier, then a capo, then underboss. He was a street boss in every sense, feared, respected, beloved. Where Castellano spoke like a banker, Della Croce spoke like a soldier. Where Paul dealt with accountants, Neil dealt with killers. He was old school. He was brutal when he needed to be, but he followed the code, the real code, and the men on the street, they followed him. So when Carlo bypassed him, it sent a signal, silent but seismic, that the old ways were no longer enough. That blood, literal, physical blood, was more important than loyalty. Carlo tried to soften the blow. He told Della Croce he would remain underboss, that Paul would run the family's business wing, and Neil would control the streets. 2 halves of the same empire, coexisting under the flag Gambino had spent 50 years raising, and for a while it worked. Della Croce, bound by honor, accepted the decision. Publicly, he showed no defiance. He told his soldiers, "We follow the boss, even when it's hard." But the fractures were already there, because in private, the men who had killed for Della Croce, who had buried rivals and bled into the concrete for the family's survival, began to grumble. They called Castellano the Pope, not out of respect, but contempt. They said he didn't understand the streets, said he cared more about steakhouses and stocks than loyalty and blood. And Paul, with his growing ego and increasing arrogance, didn't help. He stopped meeting certain capos, started isolating himself in his Staten Island mansion, a sprawling estate with marble floors, imported art, and a security wall that symbolized more than fear. It symbolized distance. By the mid-1970s, the divide was no longer quiet. 2 factions had emerged within the Gambino family: the white-collar wing, loyal to Castellano, businessmen, union leaders, construction racketeers, loan sharks, men in clean suits who made quiet money and avoided the streets. The street crew, loyal to Della Croce, old-school earners, drug runners, hijackers, killers, men who understood violence and respected it. And in between them stood Carlo, still alive, still watching, still convinced he could keep both worlds spinning in unison. He held regular meetings, spoke softly, made promises, gave blessings. But even kings age out of their own court, and in those final years, the empire no longer bowed the way it used to. Castellano began to wield his new power early. He restructured operations, refused to promote certain men, closed doors that had always remained open under Carlo's rule. One decision struck a particularly raw nerve. Paul decreed that no one in the family would deal in narcotics. On paper, it was noble. In reality, it was a death sentence for many street earners, men who made their living from heroin, from pills, from the city's growing appetite for powder. Castellano didn't just ban drugs. He made it clear that anyone caught dealing them, even for the family's benefit, would be marked. That edict, delivered without warning, turned whispers into rage. And rage in the Mafia is never just emotional, it's mathematical. Carlo saw it happening. He knew the storm was building. He could feel the cold creeping in through the cracks of his once unshakable regime, but he refused to reverse the decision. He still believed in Paul's ability to preserve the empire, not through fear, but through order. He believed that, with Della Croce's continued loyalty, the divide could be managed. He was wrong, because some wounds don't bleed, they rot, and by the time they surface, the infection is already fatal. There's a moment, recalled by one of Carlo's bodyguards, that captures the truth of it. It was in 1975. A quiet afternoon, Carlo sat on his porch, staring at the trees. He said nothing for 20 minutes. Then, without looking up, he asked, "Do you know what kills a king faster than poison?" The guard shook his head. Gambino exhaled and said, "Heirs who don't know they're still servants." And that was the tragedy. Carlo Gambino, the man who had ruled through silence and precision, who had outlived Anastasia, outmaneuvered Genovese, and outlasted Hoover, had made a single fatal miscalculation. He had mistaken obedience for stability. And no matter how carefully he structured his empire, no matter how clearly he split responsibilities, there was no stopping what would come next. Paul Castellano would one day walk into a steakhouse and never walk out. Agnello della Croce would die in a hospital, still holding the code, even as those beneath him plotted without it. And Carlo? He would not live to see it all fall apart. But the seeds were already there, planted in pride, watered by fear, fed by silence. And every empire, no matter how quiet, eventually hears the echo of its own undoing. In the last years of his life, Carlo Gambino kept no office, no carved desk, no corner room, no walnut-paneled suite overlooking the skyline he once controlled. Instead, his kingdom narrowed to a stretch of cracked stone patio behind a modest red brick house in Massapequa. And there, between the roses and the tomato vines, the last whispers of his empire passed in the shade. The garden was small, neat, unassuming. A wooden fence wrapped the perimeter. An iron chair sat crooked beside a bird bath. Rose bushes, grown from Sicilian clippings decades earlier, framed the edges like crimson watchmen. The soil was soft and dark. He tilled it himself. Neighbors said the old man was always out there, at sunrise, at dusk, trimming vines, brushing dirt from his hands, with the same precision he once used to silence an entire city. But he wasn't just growing flowers, he was still holding court. FBI agents, still assigned to watch him, called it the Vatican. They knew they wouldn't get much. Hidden microphones had long since failed. The old man never spoke above a whisper. No phones, no tapes, no notes. He met men in person, always in motion. Slow walks between basil rows, silent pauses beneath grape trellises. And still, people came. Union men, old capos, out-of-town emissaries, a senator's aide once. All stayed only minutes, all left without comment. But the pattern was clear. Carlo Gambino, frail, shrunken, 73 years old, was still running the machine. Only now, he was doing it from the dirt. His health was fading. The heart attacks had started years earlier, first mild, then sharper, a tightening behind the ribs, a drop in color that even a quiet man couldn't hide. The family hired a nurse. He refused her. He trusted only two people, his wife Catherine and his cousin Paul. And even Paul, lately, made him weary. There's an image, burned into the memory of one FBI agent who watched from a van parked 3 houses down. Gambino at dusk, bent slightly at the spine, a sweater draped over his shoulders, a rose in one hand, a clipboard passed to him in the other. He didn't read it. He nodded once, handed it back. Nothing was written down, but something had just been approved. That was the genius of it. Even at the edge of death, Gambino didn't slow down. He shrunk his empire until it fit within arm's reach, and he ruled it all without speaking a full sentence. But age had done what guns, indictments, and betrayal never could. It made him doubt. He rarely admitted it, not out loud, but in quiet moments, when the garden was empty and the sky turned gray, the weight settled in his chest like something more than illness. Regret, not for what he'd done, not for the lives ended or the fortunes built, not even for the laws he bent until they snapped, but for what would come after. He had trusted Paul Castellano with the keys. He had believed in succession without fire, in control without cruelty. But as Paul expanded his reach, built his mansion, distanced himself from the street, made enemies with every suit he wore, Carlo began to see the cracks forming. He had ruled with silence. Paul ruled with walls. Carlo had built trust. Paul demanded obedience. And in those final seasons, Gambino started to understand. You can pass on power, but not legacy. Legacy is earned, not inherited. And even kings misread the bloodlines. Della Croce still visited, not often, but when he came, he didn't sit. They walked together, 2 old men, both knowing they were relics. One chosen to inherit, the other passed over, but never forgotten. They didn't talk about Paul. They talked about the old days, about how men used to swear in churches and die in basements, about how the silence meant something back then. Now, the young ones wore gold watches and spoke too loudly in restaurants. Gambino said once, "They want to be seen. They think power is something that shines." Della Croce only nodded, because he already knew the truth. Sometimes, Carlo would sit alone near the edge of the garden, beside a statue of St. Francis. He'd light a cigarette against doctor's orders and stare at the sky, not thinking of who might be listening, but of how long he had left to whisper. One evening, he called his wife over. He asked for a lemon leaf from the small tree they'd brought from Sicily in 1955. She brought it. He held it in his palm for several minutes. He said, "It smells the same, even now." She smiled. He didn't, because in his mind, the world around him had changed. Louder, faster, disloyal, and even though the leaf still held its scent, he feared the roots were dying beneath him. There is no last meeting, no dramatic farewell, no moment when the underworld paused to watch him fade. There were only the final weeks. Short walks, hands trembling at the wrist, curtains closed a little earlier. One evening, when asked by a relative how he felt, Gambino simply said, "My voice still carries, but fewer people understand it." That was the true ache of age, not the slowing blood, but the silence it leaves behind. In those final days, the garden stayed green, the tomatoes still ripened, the basil still grew, but Carlo Gambino, the boy from Palermo, the dock worker turned Don, the man who ruled without raising his voice, had begun to prepare for the one thing he couldn't outmaneuver, the end. And in that preparation, there was no drama, just quiet, just the whisper of leaves, just a chair left empty as the sun set on the most powerful man who never wanted to be seen. There was no warning, No screech of brakes, no echo of a gunshot in the dark, no knock at the door in the middle of the night. Just the soft flicker of a television screen, a pair of velvet slippers by the edge of an armchair, and an old man slumped gently into stillness. On October 15th, 1976, Carlo Gambino, the most powerful and feared mafia boss in modern American history, died the same way he had lived, quietly, completely, without a single mistake. The house in Massapequa had grown even more silent in those final weeks. His health had faltered. The heart attacks, once separated by years, had started to creep closer. He didn't mention them much, just a hand to the chest now and then. A longer pause before rising from his chair, a glance at the garden, as though calculating whether he had the strength to cross it one more time. That night, he sat alone in his favorite chair, a brown fabric recliner with the seat worn smooth and the armrests slightly dented. The TV played in front of him. A rerun of the Rockford Files filled the room with soft voices and canned music. Catherine, his wife, had gone to make tea. When she returned, he wasn't moving. There was no ambulance. The family didn't call for help, because help had never been a part of Gambino's life, and it wouldn't be part of his death. He had slipped away without ceremony. No blood, no arrest, no final betrayal, no cell, just a man, 74 years old, who had seen everything and still managed to leave before the walls collapsed. The next morning, the underworld moved in silence. Phones rang in Jersey. Doors were closed in Queens. Men who hadn't spoken in years made quiet calls to each other. No orders were given, but everyone understood what this meant. The king had left the board, and in his absence the pieces would begin to move again, without strategy, without harmony, just raw instinct, greed, and fear. There was no newspaper headline that captured it, no editorial that grasped what had really ended that day, because Gambino had done what no one before him had accomplished. He had defied every prophecy. He had avoided bullets, dodged trials, outlived rivals, declined power gracefully, and died with his slippers on, at home, under a blanket, in front of a television screen. He had rewritten the Mafia rulebook, not by changing the words, but by refusing to follow the ones that mattered most. All bosses die bloody. All power ends in betrayal. No one escapes the game. Gambino had escaped. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was overcast. Brooklyn wore its usual gray, thick clouds over red brick, the scent of rain that hadn't come yet. The church, Our Lady of Grace, sat quiet under the weight of unspoken things. There were no reporters allowed, no photographs, no circus of mourners throwing roses at passing hearses, just black coats, long shadows, and the deepest silence Brooklyn had ever seen. They came in pairs. Men from Newark, Miami, Buffalo, Philadelphia. Union leaders, restaurant owners, retired capos, men who hadn't left their homes in years, stepped onto the cold pavement for this. Not because they had to, but because to not come would have been remembered. Inside the church, the service was short. No grand eulogy, no parade of speakers. Just a few words, a prayer, and the quiet movement of aware eyes that didn't need to meet to speak volumes. Outside, the sidewalk remained still. No crowd pushing against ropes. No FBI vans rolling by. Even the government knew. Let the dead man have his silence. But silence doesn't last. Not in this world. In the days that followed, the structure Gambino left behind began to sway. Paul Castellano, named successor in quiet back rooms and whispered over garden fences, took the reins. But he did not command the fear his uncle had. And in every man who had once bitten back their ambition, something old began to rise again. Doubt, rage, entitlement. Gambino's death created not just a power vacuum, but a moral one, because the last man who had believed in the old codes was gone. There's a story told among old-timers, one of those murmured recollections too poetic to fact-check, that on the night Gambino died, someone drove past his home around 1 o'clock a.m., and through the curtains, they saw the television still glowing, the chair empty, the garden still, the house folded into itself, as if even the bricks understood what had been lost. Carlo Gambino wasn't remembered for speeches. He wasn't remembered for violence. He wasn't remembered for generosity or cruelty or innovation. He was remembered for discipline, for restraint, for surviving what no one else could. He taught a generation of killers how to disappear in plain sight. He showed men how to hold power without ever holding the knife. And in the end, he walked away from a life that had consumed every other man who tried to rule it. He didn't leave behind memoirs. He didn't leave behind confession tapes. He didn't write a single word of his legacy, but his legend was carved into the silence that followed him, into the respect that outlasted fear, and into a garden where whispers had once ruled the world. He was the last of his kind, a king without a crown, a boss without a trial, a ghost who never needed to haunt the world he left behind, because it still moved in the rhythm he had written. You would think it ended there, a quiet death, a closed casket, a name etched into silence. But Carlo Gambino's story didn't die on October 15th, 1976. If anything, it only became more dangerous. Power doesn't like to be orphaned, and in the vacuum left by Gambino's departure, something restless began to stir, not just in Brooklyn, but across the entire underworld. The streets had lost a compass, not a moral one. Gambino never pretended to be good, but a discipline, a code, a silence, and silence, once broken, doesn't return. Paul Castellano, hand-picked successor, had always been an odd choice. He wasn't born from the streets. He didn't have the scars. He had fine suits, a stately mansion on Todd Hill, and an obsession with white meat chicken over violence. He was Gambino's cousin and brother-in-law, but more than that, he was his mirror in values. Quiet, calculated, strategic. Paul had learned well from the boss who'd made him. But what he didn't inherit was respect, at least not from everyone. John Gotti was the opposite, brash, flashy, loud. He didn't whisper in gardens. He roared in nightclubs. Gotti watched Castellano rise to power and felt nothing but contempt. To Gotti, Castellano was a businessman pretending to be a gangster, and worse, he was changing things. Paul distanced himself from drug dealing, made moves that cut into the street crew's profits, and surrounded himself with insulated aides instead of seasoned capos. Men like Gotti, who made their bones the hard way, felt betrayed, like the soul of the family was being rewritten by a man who didn't bleed for it. The hit was not sanctioned. It defied every unwritten law Gambino had built his kingdom on. But Gotti didn't ask permission. On December 16, 1985, in the slush and steel of Midtown Manhattan, Paul Castellano stepped out of a black Lincoln in front of Sparks Steakhouse, expecting a steak dinner and a conversation. He never made it to the curb. Gunmen emerged from the shadows, firing in broad daylight. Castellano was hit 6 times. He fell backward in a sprawl of expensive wool and arterial red. Beside him, Thomas Bellotti, his driver and underboss, was shot to death before he could reach for anything. It was brutal, public, cinematic, and it was the death blow to the old world Carlo Gambino had curated. When the dust settled, John Gotti emerged as the new boss of the Gambino family, but what he claimed in blood, he couldn't preserve in silence. Where Gambino built an empire by disappearing behind curtains, Gotti became addicted to spotlight. He wore Brioni suits. He smiled at cameras. He strutted down Mulberry Street like it was a movie set, and slowly, the rot crept in. The FBI, which had once failed to crack the inner sanctum of Carlo Gambino's world, now had listening devices in every corner of Gotti's. His own consigliere, Sammy the Bull Gravano, would eventually flip and testify against him. The tapes were damning, the betrayal historic. Gotti, the self-made boss, would be sentenced to life in prison in 1992, dying behind bars in 2002. By then, the Gambino family, once the gold standard of American organized crime, was in ruins, decimated from the inside, eroded from the outside, and haunted by the ghost of a man who'd done it all differently. Because here's the thing about Carlo Gambino. He never recorded a word. He never penned a single confession. No memoir, no tell-all, no press interviews, no second thoughts. He left behind only myth. And myth is the one thing you can't wiretap. Ask any modern gangster, those still trying to play the game in a world that's changed too fast for them. Ask them who they admire. They'll name their local crews. Maybe quote Gotti, maybe mention Scarface like it was real, but they'll whisper Gambino because he was the last one who won. The only true boss of bosses who died without handcuffs, without a bullet in the head, without a son in witness protection or a brother turned rat. He died with his slippers on, not just in body, but in reputation. They still tell stories about him in places where stories matter. Little clubs in Staten Island, bakeries in Bensonhurst, dim apartments in Queens where old men remember things they were never supposed to say out loud. They say Gambino could read a man before he spoke, that he could kill you without raising his voice or save you with one phone call. They say he had one rule above all others: never let the world know what you think. That's how they own you, and he never broke it. Even the FBI in its post-mortem reports admitted something strange. They had chased him for decades, tapped phones, tailed cars, flipped soldiers, but not once did they record his voice saying anything that mattered. Not a threat, not a confession, not an order. He was there, always there, but never provable. As if the closer you looked, the more he vanished. And that's the legacy that refused to die. Not the empire, it crumbled. Not the successors, they failed. But the silence, the art of controlling everything while revealing nothing. The discipline to build something immense, and then disappear before it collapsed. Carlo Gambino became the blueprint for a kind of power that doesn't need a throne, the kind that doesn't boast, doesn't explode, just waits and whispers and fades on its own terms. Power often screams, in headlines, in bullets, in fire, but not always. Sometimes it moves like breath through a keyhole, silent, precise, and final. In the long history of American organized crime, through decades of car bombs, courtroom drama, and tabloid splashes, no figure ever held so much power while appearing to hold so little as Carlo Gambino. His was a kingdom built not on spectacle, but on silence. Born in Palermo, forged in Brooklyn, he arrived as a boy and died as a myth. From the beginning, Gambino understood something his louder peers never did: that noise is a liability, that visibility invites vulnerability, that if you want to endure, you cannot burn too brightly. Others chased infamy. He hunted leverage, and he always found it. While other bosses built empires that flared and collapsed like matches, Gambino built a shadow that never flickered. He didn't have a signature car. He didn't flash rings the size of eyes. His voice was rarely heard outside the room he was in, but the message carried because Gambino didn't need to raise his voice, not when entire boroughs leaned in to hear the whisper. He studied men the way surgeons study bodies, looking not for what was obvious, but what was weak, what they feared, what they hid, what they couldn't say no to. He didn't threaten, he arranged. He didn't explode, he waited. To Gambino, chaos was useful, but only if it could be predicted and contained. Emotion was an asset when it belonged to someone else, never to him. Violence, to him, was a tool, never a language. He ordered deaths, yes, but not out of rage, not for display. He killed the way a farmer pulls weeds, quietly, efficiently, only when growth required it. You wouldn't hear a shot, you'd just notice the chair was empty the next day, and if anyone asked what happened, no one did. His court wasn't held in neon clubs or flashy mansions. It was kitchens, stoops, and storefronts that didn't make the paper. He didn't sit on thrones, he leaned against counters, listened, waited, and then, with 5 words or fewer, changed the trajectory of a man's life. That was the game, not dominance, direction. And the most terrifying thing, you could never quite be sure if he liked you, or hated you, or knew you at all. He gave nothing, no glint, no tick, no flare of temper. Even his enemies called him unreadable, but they obeyed him anyway. Because Gambino wasn't interested in being remembered, he was interested in being effective. In the Mafia, reputation is currency, but Gambino proved that fear, in its purest form, has no face. His power didn't come from speeches or theatrics. It came from consistency, from never breaking the rules he himself lived by, from never asking others to do what he wouldn't tolerate in himself. He didn't brag, he didn't pose, he didn't need to. And that's what made him dangerous, because men who kill for attention always want to be seen. But men who kill to solve a problem, they disappear. And Gambino, he was already gone by the time you realized the problem was you. This final chapter isn't about a hit. It's about a pause. It's about a moment between 2 moves when no one speaks because they're waiting to see what the quiet man will do. And even in death, Gambino holds that pause. Because what he built wasn't a headline. It was a rhythm, a way of operating, a doctrine etched not in ink, but in silence. And that silence became his weapon. While Gotti shouted and crumbled, while bosses turned on their own blood, Gambino's legend only deepened because he was the one they never caught on tape. He was the one who never got named in court. He was the one who never had to explain himself. No one heard him rise, no one watched him fall, but everyone felt the weight of where he stood. He never asked to be remembered, but history has no choice, because in a world where gangsters fought to be kings, Carlo Gambino became something rarer, a ghost who ruled from the shadows. No screams, no stage, just a long, unbroken silence that never quite left the room. A soft piano begins, just a few notes, slow and clean, like someone remembering aloud but choosing which memories not to say. Then, faded light, archival footage, grainy images, yellowing at the edges. First, a ship manifest, 1921, SS San Giovanni, docked in New York Harbor. Among the names, Carlo Gambino, age 19, country of origin, Italy. Occupation, laborer. No fanfare, no sirens, just a boy from Palermo stepping onto Ellis Island with a worn suitcase and darker intentions. He was 5'7", eyes like black stone, and already older than his years. That name, penciled on immigration forms, would one day be carved into history in far sharper ink. Next, a photograph. Brooklyn, early 1930s. 2 men in overcoats share a cigarette in the shadow of a butcher shop. One leans, one listens. Gambino is the one listening. He always listened more than he spoke. That's how he learned where the city cracked and how to own the cracks. He was quiet even then, eyes drawn not to the camera, but to the space just beyond it, as if even at 25, he was already thinking 5 moves ahead. Another photo. Appalachian, New York. The police raid changed everything, exposed the mafia as real, organized, dangerous, dozens of bosses arrested, headlines screamed, but Gambino? He had already slipped away before the first badge hit the door, because control for him was never about presence. It was about placement, like a piece on a chessboard that doesn't move, but dictates every move around it. Then, a funeral. Brooklyn, October 1976. Thousands attended. No press, no spectacle, just long black coats, tightly drawn collars, and men who hadn't cried in decades lowering their heads as if the city itself had fallen silent. The man in the casket wore slippers, because death, for him, came not with violence, but with rest. He passed watching television, a heart attack, soft and final, and that was the final move, to vanish not in chaos, but in calm. No bullets, no betrayal, just sleep. Now, a gravestone, plain, modest, the name Gambino etched without flourish, no emblems, no declarations of rank, just silence. But silence, in his story, speaks louder than anything else. The camera drifts, the music softens, the light fades from sepia into black. And what remains? A name, a myth, a shadow large enough to still stretch across Brooklyn sidewalks, whispered in corners, evoked in warnings. Carlo Gambino remains the singular figure in organized crime, to die with complete control. No deal, no memoir, no televised trial, no wiretap audio looped on the evening news. Just vanishing, not like smoke, but like breath held so long you forget it was ever there. Because in this world of glass-eyed killers and backroom gods, the end is almost never dignified. It comes with betrayal, with screaming, with cement, with cuffs. It ends in a courtroom or a coffin, but rarely in a bedroom in slippers. That is the anomaly. That is the legend. He didn't just outlive the others, he outplayed them. And that's the point. This story isn't just about crime. It's about patience, it's about presence disguised as absence. It's about a man who mastered when not to act, and in doing so, controlled everything. He built a kingdom without towers. He left behind no blueprint, only an echo, steady, quiet, relentless. In the world of organized crime, few escape. Fewer still disappear on their own terms. Carlo Gambino did both, and not with glory, not with fame, but with something more enduring, control. And in that silence, his legend never stopped speaking.